Vidhi's Law with a Difference series, where we discuss some of the key ideas that we have put forth in our briefing book to deal with the post-COVID-19 world. Our briefing book is called Towards a Post-COVID-19 World. It's a collection of 25 ideas for legal and institutional reform on how India can deal with this post-COVID-19 world, in what ways, what kind of changes are needed. Today's discussion, our focus on empowering the third tier of government. And by the third tier of government, we basically mean panchayats and urban local bodies. However, for the purpose of our discussion and given the time that we have, we thought it best to focus on urban local bodies, given that so far the focus of COVID-19, or rather the impact of COVID-19, has largely been in urban areas. And what it has done is it has sort of shown up where there is a gap in India's state capacity. We have, of course, proposed certain constitutional and legal changes, which we will go through in this discussion. And we have with us today two eminent experts who have joined us to discuss this issue. I'll very briefly introduce them before we go into the discussion. We have Srinivas, who is head civic participation at Janaagraha, but those of us in Bangalore know him better as the person behind Citizens for Bengaluru. He's been involved in a lot of civic activities and he's an activist for urban participation in this urban governance in Bengaluru. We have Mathew. He's a consultant at the Center for Law and Policy Research. He's somebody who writes very regularly on issues related to urban governance and constitutional matters. He has recently written an excellent article, which I hope we will get a chance to discuss, on how India's constitution does not address some of the most pressing needs of third-tier government. And of course, we are joined by my Vidhi colleagues, Sneha Vishaka and Ritwika Sharma, who are co-authors of the piece on third-tier government, third-tier governance, and how to empower it in our briefing book. So welcome, guys, and thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar. And without any further ado, let us jump right into the discussion. Ritwika, can you just take us, what are the kinds of constitutional changes that you think are needed in this particular, in the context of empowering the third tier? Everyone talks about the 73rd and 74th amendments, but what do they really do and why do we think they're not enough?
Yeah. Thanks, Alok. I'll jump right into it by giving a small disclaimer. In our research on local governments, we've realized that local government reform empowering the third tier can take widely different forms based on several factors. So while rural local bodies might require a certain set of reforms, urban local bodies compared to that might require certain tweakings over there. Similarly, sector-specific necessities might require us to target health differently than, let's say, education, fisheries, land improvement, something of that sort. But for the limited discussion that I will be, my limited remarks on proposed constitutional changes, I will talk about constitutional changes that can empower both the local and the urban local bodies. The kind of constitutional changes that we would want covers both these aspects. So one oft-cited criticism that's been leveled against the 73rd and 74th amendments has been that pursuant to these amendments, while India has had local government, local self-government has been a sort of misnomer for India. That's been primarily because of the fact that local governments are institutions which have been a creation of state-specific acts. Let's take a step backward and talk about some historical factors that led to the enactment or that necessitated the 73rd and 74th amendments. Now, it is not as if Panchayati Raj institutions did not exist prior to the 73rd amendments, not as if some sort of urban local governance did not exist prior to the 74th amendments. There were certain specific factors, and historically we've seen numerous committees, the Balwant Rai Committee, the Ashok Mehta Committee, the LM Singhvi Committee, which we can say sort of preceded these two amendments. There were certain specific reasons which sort of required constitutional recognition for Panchayati Raj institutions. And if we go to the statement of objects and reasons of the 73rd constitutional amendment, it specifically mentions that Panchayati Raj institutions, in spite of having existed for several years, have not had the kind of status and dignity of viable and responsive bodies due to certain factors. Numerous reasons cited, like absence of regular elections, prolonged supersessions, insufficient representation of certain groups such as women, such as scheduled castes, certain other groups. These are the kind of reasons that necessitated the 73rd and 74th amendments. Now, if we go through the amendments actually and the two parts that these amendments introduced, parts 9 and parts 9A, we'll see that there are certain mandatory provisions, certain things that state governments are supposed to mandatorily do while recognizing or bringing into effect local governments, certain others being discretionary. So possibly because of the kind of problems that were ailing local governments, we see that provisions about establishment of rural, local, and urban local bodies is, well, obviously, a mandatory function, a mandatory act that the state governments have to do. Direct elections, compulsory elections in every 5 years, representation of certain groups. These are all mandatory provisions under the 73rd and 74th Amendments. What's not mandatory, what's been discretionary is actual devolution of functions. What functions can be devolved to urban and local bodies. And of course, there's been some litigation as to what sort of leeway state governments have while devolving these functions, but that's a separate topic for discussion. So the most significant aspect of these amendments is that they do not, in fact, mandate the implementation of self-government, so to speak. They mandate the creation of self-government. Right. So in a way, what's happened is there's been an incremental or a marginal change from the pre-1993 provision, 93 being the year when these amendments came into effect. There's been a marginal and incremental change, while the balance of the political relations at the subnational level has not exactly changed.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, let me just quickly bring in Sneha to talk about what is it that did fundamentally change, and what is it that even though states were empowered, what have they not done? Where is the weakness in the legislation?
So, just following what Ritwika said, right? So basically what the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments did was lay out a framework through which devolution of functions, powers, and resources can be made to the local governments, both at rural and urban levels. However, how they go about doing that, the constitution left it up to the discretion of individual states. So I think what we see in India is that some states have implemented the constitutional, what the constitutional amendment sort of the scheme demanded. Some states have not. So one of the reasons why in the briefing book entry, we sort of highlight Kerala in particular, because I think after 1993, one of the first states to actually implement devolution of powers to local bodies were Kerala and West Bengal, unlike other states. So what does this look like, right? I think when we talk about what does it mean, at least like in the urban context, I want to talk about briefly. One is the setting up of ward committees, setting up of representative ward committees, and bringing ward committees into the way in which governance takes place in the everyday, modalities of what local governance looks like in urban areas. So it's also reflected in the way that these laws are drafted. So if you take a look at something like the UP Municipalities Act as well as the Kerala Municipalities Act, there is thinking in terms of what each level does, what are the different functions that the ward committees will do, what the districts will do, what the state government will do, there is a clarity of thought, and there is a functional devolution and a devolution of powers. But that's not often the case with a number of other states where they merely reiterate all the matters listed in Schedule 12 directly, without any thinking about how this went out. Is that in Kerala, one of the reasons this worked is because it's not just because they passed an amendment to the Municipalities Act in line with the 74th Amendment. There was also a People's Plan campaign that was launched in order to ensure that this could take place. So This involved a massive training program at multiple levels. So I don't think that merely legal reform by itself can actually do this, because we can take an example of Bangalore itself. Because one of the things that under the JNNURM scheme, one of the conditions that the central government had placed was that release of funds was tied to community participation laws being passed by several states. So Karnataka, Maharashtra, and a number of other states had passed community participation laws on paper, but they were not actually effective. Like, to give you one example, because each of these laws is so different in each state. In Karnataka, for instance, there is a veto power that is given to the councillor, so for a ward committee meeting. So when you have a system that does not actually devolve power, which is essentially on paper, but that does not really allow this to happen, you don't really have functioning ward committees in the first place. But this is even coming to the point that ward committees have been set up. I think in Karnataka in particular, ward committees were briefly set up for a period in the 90s, and then they lapsed again. And I think there was a lot of citizen activism, and Srinivas might be able to talk about how the civil society had gotten involved. So I think when I just like to talk about what it looks like for state governments to devolve these powers is one, to ensure that there is a legal mechanism for the setting up of representative ward committees that meet regularly. There is a clear functional devolution, there is a clear demarcation of powers, and there is a clear allocation of resources. One other thing I'd like to point out, I think that works for Kerala, which does not say work for other states, is that back in the People's Plan campaign itself, 35% of the state development budget was devolved to local governments as untied funds. So they essentially ensured that local governments will be able to use these funds in the manner they see fit, because the belief is basically that the people in a particular area will best be able to determine what their needs are. And one of the reasons that COVID response has also been strong, because health is something that local governments had completely taken over for a couple of decades now. So I think these are basically the reasons why this is really important, because I think what we see in a time of crisis like this is that if you don't empower your local governments, there is an institutional lack of capacity. So only because they've been doing this for the last couple of decades, I think we see the fruit of that kind of structure.
So, and I bring us on that specific point that you mentioned, Sneha. How have local governments responded to the COVID crisis? And Srinivas, as somebody who has been involved, been seen on the ground what has happened and what hasn't. I was wondering if you could give us a bit of a perspective. How have local governments coped, or where have they not been able to cope with meeting the challenges that COVID-19 has thrown up, right? And what is it that you have seen on the ground, where they have failed, where they have succeeded? Where do you think the gap exists?
Sure. Thanks, Alok. Thanks for having me here. It's a fascinating discussion. The COVID pandemic handling by the government has clearly demonstrated what it is that we mean by theory of subsidiarity, or the decisions need to be made at the closest level to the people. Why those things are important are understood better than ever before because of COVID. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we're perfectly clear. Yes.
Okay, sorry. There was an echo coming. All right. So, for example, if you guys remember what happened back in April, there used to be these daily bulletins and weekly reports on the number of districts in India, and red and green, and so on and so forth, right? There used to be districts colored. After a few weeks, there was huge resistance that, there's a discrepancy between the state red list and the central red list. And that we don't think the Karnataka cabinet, for example, has written to the union government saying that what you think is red is not red. What we think is, green is not what you have in your list. You guys should not be announcing this. So basically they're telling the Karnataka government is officially, and in this case, both are same political party, mind you, they're not playing any political games, simply telling them that, look, you think you know what's going on, but that's not what it is. It's something else here. You're so far from here, you don't know what the reality is. Your data is stale, your synchronization from different data sources not working. And this is what the Karnataka state government is telling the union government of India. Go forward few days later, and almost same thing happening between BBMP and the state government, where the BBMP is telling you that, no, it's not that. It is this particular ward, Padrayanpura ward, has these cases and we've contained it. And, I won't prolong this story, but yesterday in my neighborhood, there was a containment zone that contained exactly one home. Okay. They put those ugly looking aluminum sheets in front of the house and behind the house. Last week it was an apartment. If one floor of the apartment has a positive case, the floor above and below was the containment zone. Now the containment zone is that flat, okay? And people in outside Bangalore should take those pictures of how we contain those apartments, but I digress there. What does all this tell you? This tell you that you know how to solve the problem at the lowest level. You don't need to, a ward in a big city like Bangalore is like I don't know, maybe a district in New Zealand. Bangalore is twice as big as New Zealand population wise, right? We all know that. But, we can't possibly run this thing, with thinking in terms of a single unit and any of that. the government capacity is completely not there. In the long lockdown period, many of us have assumed that, as we saw the first phase of the mismanagement, in my view, personal view, occurred when in the distribution of the ration kits to the migrants and people that have lost livelihoods and all that. How that is done? That entire process was done without getting the BBMP or the councillors or the ward committees involved. It was done in a different way at a, the ration shop level, or a centralized system in the city, and a missed call number, and resolutions and all that. And every day you would get all these reports that so many people are complaining that they haven't got it. And we as a civil society, I was part of various network of groups that was doing this, and we'd go to these communities, and nobody has ever knocked on their doors. Nobody has distributed them because they just didn't have the understanding of where to go. But if you look at one particular ward or a locality in Bengaluru or Mumbai, you talk to the local councillor, corporator, winner or loser. Let's say there are two parties, there'll be two leaders and their network. Every one of them in that political system would know which part of my ward has migrants, which state they are from. Do they eat jola the roti, or do they eat white rotis, wheat, or do they eat rice? They know that level of detail. The political system is very smart about local dynamics because of vote banks and various other things that we all know about. But what is the point here? The point is that they have local intelligence, local knowledge, local solutions. And yet, when the state responds, the system responds to a pandemic, it ignores all of that and thinks that we know better. We'll create a missed call number, we'll create a dashboard with some big numbers and all that. And slowly, as time progresses, they realize that, okay, we may need a war room in Delhi, but we need a war room in Karnataka. Now in Karnataka, in Bengaluru, as some of you are from there, you can see that we have another kind of problem. We went to a booth level management where we said, ward is too big. Let's try to solve the problem at a booth level. Let's see if we can minimize deaths and discomfort caused by COVID at a booth level. Why booth level? Because in a booth, there's only 1,000 to 2,000 people maximum, and 400 homes. It is much easier to find out who are the vulnerable groups, who are the people that are showing symptoms. Because of stigma and other reasons, people are not coming forward to get tested. But if you are within a booth, then you are more likely to confide in the people that are part of your booth, that are your neighbors, that are your residents. You can talk to.
And just to clarify, these are booths as per the electoral list. This is not something.
These are electoral booths. So each ward in Bengaluru has 30 to 60 booths, because the wards that are so big, 30,000, 50,000, even 1 lakh. So the booths are very big in Bengaluru, and the wards are very big in Bengaluru. So we went down to that. At the same time, the state government also issued another order appointing 8 ministers and 8 IAS officers for 8 zones of BBMP. So on one hand, there is this plan, and on the other hand, there is a booth level plan, and we're all looking at these things. And so one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing in government. So this is a huge problem in local government. And my suspicion is that, and researchers like Ritwika and Sneha would know better, and the folks and my colleagues in Janaagraha would know better. It is my feeling is that this is a particularly pronounced problem in the cities that are capital cities. If you go away from the capital cities, then it's a different story. Still a problem, but it will be a different story, right? And all of this comes back to empowerment of the third tier that we are really talking about today. I think unless and until we do that, using all methods, using the legal framework, using the citizens, all of that, we are not going to see any of that. I think I can come back to this topic later in the interest of time, but I totally agree.
Thanks, Srinivas. I'll just bring Mathew into this. Mathew, what I was just sort of specifically wanted is we have sort of seen what sort of needs to be there. And I think when we sort of look for what is the problem that we're trying to fix, one of the things that I have written about, and we've had this discussion in the past, is that our constitution does not seem to see the city or even a village as a fundamental unit of governance. It's just that, the initial approach in the Pareto principles was, devolve powers to them. Then the 73rd and 74th said, you should try to, because we think they're important. But I think the point that a paper that you've written about, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about that paper, is I think fundamentally our constitution does not have provisions for cities.
Yeah, thanks, Alok. So when we're talking about empowering the third, tier of government, I mean, a fundamental question that I would raise is, is there a third tier of government under the constitutional scheme? And as I've argued in that paper and elsewhere also, it's become a truism to say that after the 73rd and the 74th Amendment, India moved from a two-tier system to a three-tier system. But if you actually examine the constitutional design of local governments, both rural and urban, there are, it's hard to say that it is a real sort of independent, autonomous unit of government with all the functions that it carries, right? So let's just look at the nature of power, the nature of power that the Constitution vests in these local governments. Does it have legislative power, executive power, and judicial power, just like any other sort of sovereign level of government in a federal sort of theory? Executive power, it has some, at least within the scheme. Legislative, it is sort of ambivalent, in terms of they might have some sort of powers about bylaws, but otherwise that's delegated legislation. And judicial power, obviously you don't have a sort of institution like higher courts, or anything of that equivalent, at the local level. So one is in terms of that sort of design. The other, if you're looking at from a standard federalism theory, is about questions of do you have an autonomous regime or area of functioning? Do you have a set of functions which are clearly within the exclusive jurisdiction of the local body, right? And the best place for that us to look from a constitutional sense, and not just looking at the 74th. If you're looking at it in a broader way, it's to look at the 7th schedule, right? The 7th schedule has 3 lists. That's a union list, state list, and concurrent list. It's not union list, state list, and local government list. So what does that mean? It means that there are 3 lists, but powers are actually, distributed between 2 levels of government. That is the center, that's the union, and the state. So this is the context in which local governments still function post 73rd and 74th. So as people, I've sort of been engaging in this over 7-8 years now. Initially, all of us were like 74th Amendment, 73rd Amendment. These are huge reforms, revolutionary. But what I'm saying is we should, have a cautionary note about the scale of reform that is being proposed there. It has its limitations, and of course, the bigger issue is about, even with those limitations, are they being implemented? That's a larger implementation question. But purely in terms of constitutional design, my argument, at least it's over the last few years that I've been able to understand, is that to see them as independent, autonomous unit of government is not part of the constitutional design, and then it's not really a third tier by itself. It's almost like because the powers that it derives is about powers from the second list, right? In 7th schedule, some of those powers may be devolved to the local government as per the 11th schedule and the 12th schedule.
Yeah.
So if you look at 243, G and W, you'll see that state can devolve powers, some of its functions to the local government. And local government remains an item 5 under list 2, which basically means it's a state subject.
Yeah.
And state can then devolve some of those powers. So basically, it's it doesn't have a list of functions of itself. It has functions within function. It's almost like a Christopher Nolan sort of dream within dream sort of Inception movie, right? So if you have to look at the local government functions, firstly, there's a list of functions under the second list, purely from the constitutional design perspective. There's a list of functions there, and within those functions, some of them may or may not be devolved to the local government under the 73rd and 74th Amendment. So it's in that complex sort of arena in which it's been sort of provided. Whereas, say, if you take constitutions of Brazil or constitution of South Africa, there are clear lists. There's a local government list, and these are functions that the local government has to perform. So the fundamental point is that it's an existential question. Do local governments actually have independent sort of an independent unit of government? I would, it's arguably no. And then then it's all about to what extent can the state government legislate, and then it's up to the state. Some states have progressive legislations, and some level of implementations. Some do not have it that much, and to say that it's about a failing of the 73rd and 74th, it's not entirely right, because by the very design of it, it doesn't really provide for such a revolutionary sort of idea, as it's often sort of by all kinds of people usually said, whether it's activists or scholars. We're like 73rd, 74th Amendment created third tier of government, but states are not implementing. Well, this is actually the design the Constitution provides for. I'm not saying it's the right thing. I mean, we've been obviously on the other side saying that this is not enough, but purely from a since I guess a lot of people in the who are tuned in would be legal scholars or people interested in law. I'm saying that over the years, this is the realization that I've got. It's a process of learning and unlearning that has happened. So initially, like most lawyers, nobody cares about 73rd, 74th Amendment something. It's some body that's there. No one pays any attention. Then you get interested, and then then you think it's everything. But after a lot of time, you realize that okay, actually, you go back and unlearn it and realize that it's maybe not enough. So yeah.
So I'll bring Srinivas in on one very important point. It's something that also comes from what Mathew has said. Srinivas, I remember this, that at one of the various events that we have all been part of to discuss urban governance, there is a sense somehow that, and this follows on from what Mathew has sort of just said, that the third tier is like a very grudging, you're giving charity to these people. And somewhere, and I remember you make this point, that people have this distrust of corporators, people have this distrust of councillors. They're like, who are these people? Why should we give them more powers? Who knows what they will do with these powers? I want to sort of, because what we're essentially talking about is that today, you won't go to your MLA or your MP to say, solve my problem. You will go to, for a civic issue, you will go to your corporator or your councillor. And even in a time of crisis or an emergency, it should be your corporator or councillor who you go to. But I just sort of wanted to take, what is the thinking behind why people are so resistant to getting governance to reach to this level at the end of the day?
Wow, I'm super thrilled that you actually remember that conversation. This is my pet peeve, and a very quick point on what Mathew said. The fundamental problem, I think, is also nomenclature. We don't use the word city government at all. Municipality, panchayat, municipality. Why don't we use village government, city government, town government? If you go to talk to any senior officers in BBMP, they'll say government said this, government sent this, we will write to the government. As if they are not government, they are some, some other, people. We don't look at them as some other people, but they themselves don't respect, their own role in the governance. So, if you go to, Silicon Valley and look at where I used to live for a while, the city of Fremont, the government of the city of Fremont website, the government of Palo Alto website, the government of San Francisco website. Here we have municipal Mahanagarapalike website. It doesn't, the word government is not even percolated there. I think it has got everything to do with, how we started, I mean, a lot has been said about constitution and how India was not urban at the time, and rural India had all these feudalistic, groupings and caste-based society and all of that. So therefore it wasn't codified in a certain way. I'm not an expert by any means in that, but what I think is that in the last 15-20 years, the politics of India have dictated the deterioration of the urban local bodies. The problem of the lack of respect for councillors or the third tier of thing has got to do with the MLAs and the MPs. What I mean by that is the MLAs and MPs are kind of jobless. I hope this is not being recorded for any politicians to view, but if it is, that's fine, because I've said this before. The MLAs and MPs are disenfranchised. In a way, they're victims of the system, right? They don't have a voice. They can't speak up, and if you want to hear a great debate of parliament, somebody will send you an old YouTube link of Vajpayee or Indira Gandhi or PV, some 1990s or 80s, or you don't hear any of those things anymore, right? There is no concept of the Bengaluru MLAs, for example, standing in Vidhan Sabha and speaking about the issues of representing the citizens of Bengaluru. They just don't do that. They act like super corporators. They have to agree on certain project. It's all about sharing of the resources and projects and things like that. They don't look at it as lawmakers for Karnataka within which they're representing the residents of Bangalore. Same thing goes for MPs. So therefore, what do? If you don't have job, if Alok doesn't get, work from his boss, what will he do? He'll start meddling with the people that report to him, right? He will start trying to do what they are doing. So similar thing kind of happens. And the political system, even though each of these are independent, whether the Lok Sabha and the Vidhan Sabha and the corporation, but in the political system, they're entirely hierarchical. They don't even realize that, the MP and MLA are too different. It's not like this, but it's like this. They just don't get it. They think they are one below the other. They have a psychological thing, and people also think like that because of our way we have this whole, feudal mentality, or, the kingdoms and emperor and king and this and that. So that kind of narrative has gone into our DNA, and we keep thinking like that. We don't even think that he is an elected representative, he is another elected representative, and that she is another elected representative. She represents me in the parliament, she represents me in the state legislature, and she represents me in the council. People just don't have the concept of that, and worse, the politicians don't have a concept of that. Because of that, this happens. I think legal, there are a lot of legal people here, and Vidhi is a legal center. I think if you are working on constitutional amendments, I think one of the first thing you guys should fight on is to get rid of the whip and anti-defection law. If you do that, maybe then we'll start seeing MLAs and MPs finding their feet. We'll see more Shashi Tharoors, we'll see more, Mahua Maitra, whoever, people that can speak up in the legislature, in the parliament, and represent the voice of the people. When you get them busy with that work, they'll start acting like super contractors who can do a footpath and who can get your water supply broken, right? Today, if you go to any MLA's house at 7 a.m. in Bengaluru, you'll find 50 people standing there. And many of them have these little issues. In my street, garbage is not getting picked. And then the MLA will call the corresponding person and then go do that, right? They want to be that person that has the human interaction, voter interaction, all that. In this process, the councillors are marginalized, and the council itself doesn't have powers. If you want to empower councillors, first make the council powerful. The BBMP is probably one of the first municipalities in Bengaluru to live stream its proceedings. In the last 1 year, we've been live streaming. And I go there often, I know Mathew does, and how many people follow what's happening in that? We want to know what the speaker said and Bait Jaye in the Lok Sabha, but we don't know what the same discussion happening in the council. Whereas you go to California, people come home from work, dial into their local network channel, they will watch the council proceedings to know whether their library will be open till 9 p.m. or it will be closed at 8 p.m. due to lack of funds. So that's the level of citizen engagement created through the participatory channels, the powers given to the third tier, and then connecting that to the people in a meaningful way. I keep telling people that we need to work with corporators. We've given awards to corporators. I'll post the link on the chat window for those of interest. We've given corporator #1 awards in Bengaluru to celebrate the corporators that have conducted ward committee meetings. Even though they are not perfect, they have conducted them. Only on the basis of quantity, number of meetings conducted, we have conferred the awards to them, because that conveys the intent in getting people involved in the local governance, even though they didn't have powers. And you, Alok and Mathew, and all of you, Sneha and Ritwika, I will point out to the speeches made by the corporators in that event. Listen to what they are saying. Their voice comes out. There is no MLA in the hall. There is no MP. There is no party leaders. So now you hear them. You understand what they're saying, regardless of the party. They all are longing for better control, budget control. They have no budget to speak of. They keep on, making, requests for give money to some assembly constituency. BBMP is a municipal corporation. It allocates money based on the assembly constituencies. It's anti-constitutional. I think it's anti-constitutional. Why should any BBMP document list give money based on assembly constituencies? On what basis? Why not 198 wards or BBMP zones, right? But no, we mixed up all these lines, and therefore we've diluted their powers, and people and the MLAs and MPs don't have a job to do. So they get involved in it. We have MPs and MLAs doing road inspections. They can do inspection, no problem, but they give promises to people that I'll get this done and so on and so forth. While the suburban train, which is a central government Indian Railways project, it doesn't see the light at the end of the tunnel in 35 years. No MP has actually worked on it. And the same MPs keep getting elected and elected again and again, even though they haven't delivered on the suburban train, but they're delivering on garbage or something else, so we keep electing them again.
Yeah.
So this is a whole loop of problems. I think I've gone beyond what your scope of the question was.
No, but that's okay. I think that brings to a point about the constitutions. This whole that we've talked about in the constitution, the fact that even after the 74th Amendment, we don't find the city located in the constitution. We have about 10 minutes before we take a few questions. And for those of you who are tuning in, please type out your questions in the Q&A bar. I will take them once we finish with the discussion in about 10 minutes. I want all of our speakers to take like a couple of minutes for the final couple of questions that I have, and we can move on to the questions. I think Mathew, since I'll start with Mathew and then I'll move to Ritwika, but both of you essentially the same question. How do we rectify this absence of the city, or even for that matter, the village in the constitution, right? We have said that, the third tier doesn't really exist in the constitution, but how do we do it? Like, is it a matter of recreating the structure of the state at the city level? Is it a matter of learning from the 73rd Amendment in the context of panchayats and applying it to the cities in the 74th Amendment? How do we rectify the absence of the city in the constitution? If Mathew could take 2 minutes and then Ritwika, I'll just come.
Right. So quickly, there are different types of reforms that have been carried out. There can be constitutional reforms, legislative reforms, administrative reforms, or just some financial reforms. Right. So the higher order thing is, and the most difficult one is obviously constitutional reforms. But and I saw that in your briefing, in your briefing paper, you actually do sort of suggest some constitutional reforms, saying that the may provision shall become a shall provision under 243W of the Constitution. But I would just say that one is of course the difficulty in sort of getting a constitutional amendment through. The other is, even if you tinker with those sort of changes, it's going to be very difficult to sort of completely create some sort of a third tier of government, as you expect a state or a central government function. So I would be, I mean, we can always have ambitious reforms, but to what extent you can sort of do that when the existing provisions are not fully implemented is the question. So one is that, and quickly on the subjects that can be done, right? So there are 18 functions in the 12th schedule and 29 functions in the 11th schedule for urban and rural. But in the design itself, you don't have certain core functions like public transportation, right? Which is usually a classical city government function, is not even under the constitutional scheme, is not under with the local government. Or even things like providing housing, or even lakes and urban commons are not really mentioned. So I mean in the 12th schedule. So what I'm saying is, if you're talking about some tinkering, it would be an expansion of the 11th and 12th schedule also, involved. And the other main thing in terms of whether you do it in a constitutional sort of way, or whether you do it, in sort of legislative route, it's about the absence of a separate, financial domain. There's no domain of taxation which is exclusively with the local government, other than the ones that the state has devolved again. So 73rd and 74th do not provide for that. So basically, these are the broad constitutional reforms. But and the more practical one would be to do legislative level reforms and maybe administrative level reforms based on what some successes and are there. Kerala is often mentioned. Actually, Karnataka is not bad, especially for the rural local government. Karnataka has had a very good history of Panchayati Raj. So the reforms that are more possible, I would say, are at the state level, and I believe that that's perhaps where the focus should go to now. Given that we are a federal country, and we should all sort of start working with states more than expecting too much from a because the 73rd, 74th itself is a top-down measure for bottom-up governance. It's a very interesting thing. It's a top-down measure for bottom-up. You might need some middle level, sort of legislative reform for again bottom-up. So and the other thing is, again, you need to exert pressure from below for these reforms. If you just do it purely as an administrative legal exercise, I think someone mentioned the People's Plan campaign in Kerala. So unless you have that sort of engagement, you will not see things change. So yeah.
Ritwika, you have mentioned some very interesting set of changes, and one that I personally like was the professional tax, which devolved directly to state to the city governments rather. So what and Mathew also made this point that we can't just say leave it as give them these powers. So what do we see as the essential constitutional changes that will empower the city government?
Sure. So Alok, of course, there's this one reform that Mathew also sees. It's very ambitious to have actually that may change to shall. That's one level of reform. But when we actually go to through the text of these the 73rd and 74th amendments, we realize that there's a very discernible difference between the relationship between the first tier and the second tier, and the second tier and the third tier. Now, this discernible difference between how the third tier and the second tier interact is sort of magnified or augmented by the fact that there are not enough avenues for revenue generation for the third tier. For that, to sort of address that issue, in our briefing book entry, we mentioned that possibly we can also amend Article 276 of the Constitution. So as currently things stand, professional tax can either be channeled through the state government, then goes to the local government, or it can, in some states, it's the sole prerogative of the local governments. So we've recommended that it become through a constitutional amendment and a state level amendment that goes alongside it, so that professional tax becomes the sole prerogative of local governments. So that is one level of revenue generation that's also opened up for the local governments. The other thing I'll briefly mention, I think if we're not running out of time, is that we've also mentioned that the constitutional design is such that there is nothing either to incentivize state governments to bring about more functional devolution, neither anything that can forcefully compel them, if I can use that word, to compel them to amend their laws for more effective devolution. So that's where we mentioned that possibly the 15th Finance Commission has recommended certain grants that can be made to state governments to be transferred to local bodies. That can possibly be tied to states amending their laws to bring about more effective devolution of functions to the local governments.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think on the point of states devolving more powers and functions to the state government. So Sneha, we have these lists in 11th and 12th schedules about what should be devolved to the third government. And Mathew pointed out one huge gap, which is public transportation. Can we talk a little bit about what sort of devolution do we want, right? I mean, we know broad subject-wise, these are the things that the local government should do, but what should local government do? I mean, if you can give us an idea in the next couple of minutes or so, like what do we expect local government to do in this context?
I think, as Mathew pointed out very astutely, I think when we look at the 12th schedule, right, even what is actually mandated for local governments or city governments, as I think we should start calling it, as Srinivas mentioned, most of these are actually not under the domain of the municipal corporations and cities. So we have parastatal bodies instead that are either taking care of water, sanitation, transport, and they are under the state governmental control and not under BBMP, for example, if we're talking about in the context of Bangalore. One of the things which I think fundamentally has to be done is that planning should be brought under the mandate of the municipal corporation. It should not be undertaken by a development, like the Bangalore, PDA undertakes planning right now. So when we actually go through 12th schedule, a number of the things that it deals with has to do with planning, including transport. I think one, like as Mathew mentioned, I don't think that these are merely something that they can merely be top-down reforms. But I think very importantly, what we need to have is that the different facets of planning and running the city have to be undertaken by the BBMP. And it has to be undertaken by the agency that people have representation in. Right now we have parastatal bodies which do not have any people's representation, so they're not accountable to the people of the cities, right? So I think one major step that all states should undertake is precisely that municipal corporations should be the start and end to governance in the city, whether it's sanitation, water, electricity, transport, etc. So I think that would be one major change I would think at the legislative level.
Thank you. And Srinivas, on that point, and I think Sneha brought a very important point here, that we are not only seeing that the lack of devolution of powers, we are seeing this hollowing out of municipal authorities. And I think if you could sort of talk about why this is a very dangerous and perhaps why we should be very careful about all these various authorities being set up in parallel with the municipal authorities to run essential functions in cities.
Yeah, I mean it's a sharing of the bounty, so to speak, right? So if you have a water supply board that reports into the irrigation minister or a water resources minister versus electricity reporting into the energy minister and so on, so the political ecosystem thrives on things like that. And we have always argued that anything that begins with a B should report into the BBMP, right? We have too many agencies that begin with a B, but they don't report into the BBMP. And Sneha's point about representation is, again, I don't know how it happened, because you have these islands of governance which have no public accountability. How did we end up with a BESCOM, with a BWSSB or equivalent things in Mumbai and Ahmedabad and Chennai and all of these places, and especially public transport? How did we end up with that? We ended up with that, with my limited knowledge, because the law is so weak. The 74th Amendment didn't specify these things, and we are stuck with that, and that is itself is not seen as the right solution. So it's all totally messed up. And in the meanwhile, we have other players that are trying to take control of it, and especially in these bigger cities, where there is no district planning committees and things like that. There is no MPC functioning. I don't know if anywhere MPC is functioning. Maybe Kerala. I don't really know that. But here we have, like she rightly pointed out, we have an agency that sells land, creates layouts, and also apparently does the entire city planning. Both are given to the same agency. And how will they ever get this done? It's always controversial. It's always, allegations of scams and corruptions and all of that. You got to, keep the agency that does planning away from anything that does the implementation or have any hint of bias or creating projects for the sake of projects. But you're looking at it from a planning point of view. And the planning, the way the MPC is designed, at least it brings in the legislators of the city. It even brings in the MPs and MLAs, which I think is the right thing to do. But that never gets function. But in the meanwhile, the government will do all kinds of other things to add capacity because they just don't have it. So this is very dangerous, because now you have a situation where you don't know how much money is being spent. Your money is being spent on your city for what purpose? When we say the city budget is 12,000 crores a year, we're only talking about BBMP, and we're only talking about garbage parks and some government schools that BBMP runs and so on and so forth. We are not talking about the thousands of crores spending on pumping money from 100 kilometers out of Bangalore into Bangalore for piped water supply. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about the lack of the lakes that somebody mentioned. Imagine if these things are together and together, then you will start looking at Bangalore has so much rainwater, and why are we still importing so much water? And what happens to all the research? So there is no thinking, because the city is being robbed of the opportunity of sustainable development due to these multiple agencies. The multiple agencies are not only a pain in the neck and lack of accountability, but they're actively working against the interests of the citizens. They're making our cities less livable. So this is a very serious problem in all cities. And Janaagraha's famous line, which I like in all the presentations, and I should say our line, is that we don't have 100 different problems in 100 cities. We have the same 10 problems in all the cities. And this is absolutely right. This is the same problem in all our cities. So we need to have solution that can horizontally cut through these things. And all the things that were mentioned by Ritwika and Sneha and Mathew are all part of this. We need, and there is no one magic bullet for this. There is a legal framework, and then there is a participatory framework. In Karnataka, Alok, that the KMC Act is very strong. KMC Act talks about ward committees. Yes, it has the veto power, but who cares about that? Just put that aside for a second. The ward committees sections of the Karnataka Municipality Act gives tremendous powers to the citizens. It says you drop the ward development plan. You drop the, and the ward secretary is supposed to provide information of what is the money coming into the ward, what are the schemes of the central government and state government that you can use. But none of that actually happens in the real life. So this goes to the argument that even if you have a strong legal framework and law, unless there is a spirit of that law and people participation in it with open communication, we can't really get anywhere. So just by magically changing one word in the constitution or state legislation, we're not going to get anywhere, because these other aspects also need to be looked at. And that's where we think Janaagraha thinks the transformational change can happen only when you combine these city systems together. When we when you bring in the legal amendments along with transparency of information and create avenues for citizen participation. If the ward committee is there, but if the ward committee doesn't have information about what is the budget of the ward, how good is the ward committee? Right? And yeah, so we need to look at this from all these holistic point of view.
Thanks, Srinivas, and thank you to all our participants. We have a few questions. I'll just direct those questions to each of you, and maybe you can speak a little bit about it. The first question we have is from Sharma, who agreed with Mathew that there's very little space given to self-government in the constitution. But interestingly, in our constitution, there are more spaces given to the third tier of government within Gram Sabhas under the 5th and 6th schedule areas, where there is much clear demarcation of powers and jurisdictions. For those of you who are not familiar, 5th and 6th schedule areas apply to Adivasi areas in central India. 6th schedule applies to northeast areas in India, which empower your tribal councils and your local panchayats to do a lot more things. Mathew, what Sharma wants to know is that a good model to follow in some ways? Yeah,
I think it's a very good question. So what's worked in some ways is because it's a form of asymmetric federalism. Actually, if you look at it, the 5th schedule, 6th schedule, is an instance of asymmetric federalism where more powers are actually given to some of these areas to actually respond to the specific tribal or indigenous forms of governance that existed. And it was accompanied by PESA, Panchayat Extension to Schedule Areas Act. So both in terms of constitutional scheme as well as through the legislative enactment of PESA, it has been able to there have been some studies by CPR. If you're more interested in this, CPR has done a fairly good study of how the PESA has worked. There are some issues there, but it has had some success. And yes, I do think it can be a sort of a reference point. The only thing is that it is sort of about protecting the traditional forms of governance, and that is why in some ways there was a felt need for the community to preserve their old forms of governance, whereas we don't have that felt need. Like Bangalore or Mumbai is not saying we need to preserve our old form of governance because there's nothing there even earlier, right? So in that way, that's the only sort of operational challenge. I just want to quickly sort of address a couple of things that came up earlier. One is on 276. My sort of that is the professional tax. My view is that whether it goes to this, ideally it should go to the municipality, but there's a fundamental problem in the design of the constitution, because there you have a ceiling of how much professional tax can be there. Original ceiling was 250 rupees, and then it was amended and made 2,500 rupees. So the ceiling idea itself is problematic. So that's on that. And quickly on something that Srinivas and others were discussing on the question of parastatals. It's not just that these parastatals exist, along with local governments, and there's sort of a mess of all these too many cooks in the kitchen. It's not just a question of that. It's also the question of who is more powerful, within the scheme. If you look at it, the interesting thing is the local government is less powerful. The elected local government is less powerful than the unelected development authority. So some schemes which do not require, which is a sort of low budget sort of scheme or low budget project, can be, either you can get the approval from the local government. But the moment it is a bigger project, you need a development authority clearance. So you can just see within our administrative system the hierarchy that exists. Local government is nothing but a small little implementation agency within the eyes of the state, which is supposed to carry out some functions. Bigger functions, development authority and metropolitan development authority, MMRDA, BMRDA, BDA would carry out. For fixing your roads and pipes and garbage, you can carry out. So that is a fundamental sort of thing. It's not just the multiple agencies, but the hierarchy of powers that exist within the multiple agencies. So
that's a good point. That's a good point, Mathew. But I'll just move on to the next question, because there's a lot more that we want to raise here. The next question is, and I'll ask Ritwika to answer this. Should we think of a model of city-states for large cities like Mumbai and Bangalore? And I assume when the person asks this question, they have in mind Delhi. Should we think of recreating the model that Delhi has for large urban areas? Because one of the points that Srinivas also made was that capital cities tend to suffer from this problem. Do you think separating them as city-states in some ways, do you think that can address some of these issues?
Possibly. And the thing is, like, most of our research currently has actually been focused more on the Panchayati Raj institutions. So my reading on this has not exactly been exactly what should have been. But yeah, some of the problems that we have thought about while doing research on urban local bodies generally has been the kind of things that we've read about parastatals and the kind of issues that we were just discussing with Mathew. So again, and please, like, I would like Srinivas and Mathew to possibly pitch in here. Possibly, yes, like city-states might be the answer here, but again, like I would refrain from commenting in great detail about city-states right now.
We'll just come back to this question because there are a couple of more very interesting questions that I sort of wanted to pitch to our panelists. When the local, how do we encourage? This is a question. I'm paraphrasing this question. How do we encourage local government to work harmoniously with the above government, especially when they are of different political parties? And I think, Srinivas, you made this point a little bit. So if you could take this time to elaborate, how is it? And this is a point that you made that, even at the local level, there is some level of collaboration between corporators of different parties. But how do we promote this kind of cooperation between, say, corporators of one party and the MLAs of another party? How do we ensure that they work in tandem?
There is a lot of cooperation already. It's just that it happens beyond public view in a different way. So, the rhetoric that you see in the media and the kind of election campaigns and all is different from what happens between the elections within the 5 years is very different from what happens the few months leading up to the elections. So a lot of people may not realize that, but there is terrific cooperation. And some might argue that there is a lot of cooperation even during elections. I won't go too deep into that, but I think you know the drift. So the idea is that, if you make the job of the councillor and the MLA clear, and it's the synergy can be seen, and you can create a win-win situation, right, where everybody wins, then automatically they'll start working. At the end of the day, all politicians, while their allegiance is to the party and the party leader and so on, at the end of the day, what is happening, especially in the city context, in the big city context, is that the number of people that elect a person, whatever role that is, corporator or MLA or MP, the number of people that are now participating in the voting process and are not influenced by caste, money, region, religion, that is slowly but steadily increasing. So that's why you see every corporator active on WhatsApp. That's why you see MLAs and MPs on Twitter. That's why you see them reaching out to you in different ways than before. Now, nobody can complain that my MLA or my corporator is not accessible. They're all accessible. If somebody says they're not accessible, my simple answer to them is you haven't tried enough, right? They are more than accessible. If you ask me or any of our hundreds of volunteers, all of them are accessible all the time, including ministers and so on. Right. So why is that happening? Because they have a growing sense of what the electorate is and how people are perceiving to be. This is a positive sign for democracy. For all the flaws and all the things we talk about various things we discussed today, one of the really good things that's happening is that transparency is coming. Thanks to WhatsApp, perhaps, thanks to social media, thanks to people like us. Look at this. There are some 21 people here on a Monday evening listening to all the constitutional amendments and, 74th Amendment, all this stuff, Greek and Latin things, which were Greek and Latin for me a few years ago, right? So there is hope. These are the people that will take this forward. And while Alok and his team and Mathew and his team will, and Janaagraha kind of institutions will make the legislative changes and influence and advocacy and all of that, it actually falls on the shoulders of those of us that want to advance, participatory democracy forward, that want to take these things, actually live the spirit of the law, right? I think all the references to law says that in letter and spirit, right? We have a lot of letters, but we don't have much of spirit. And one of the reasons we don't have spirit is we don't understand it. What is it supposed to be? If more people understand it, then they'll start doing the right things. And that is a job that all of us can do, is to break down this conversation we talked about in a way that a large number of people can understand and participate, live that daily experience. That's a challenge that we all have. And Janaagraha has been working on civic learning. How do you make school children understand civics beyond the textbook, right? How do you create platforms for engaging with the civic agencies that we were talking about? Why should you bribe somebody or call an MLA or corporator when there's a much easier solution to get your problem fixed? But people are not aware of it. So these are all the elements of it that all of us need to work on. Thanks,
Srinivas. And unfortunately, we've just run out of time. There are a few more questions, but what I would suggest participants is please come to the Vidhi Facebook page and leave your questions. This discussion is going to be up online on the Vidhi Facebook page and on the YouTube page. Please post your questions on the Facebook page. We'd be happy to answer it, or we will ask our panelists if they can answer the questions in text. But unfortunately, today we are out of time for this webinar. Thank you all for having joined us for this discussion. Thank you to all our participants, of course, starting with Mathew and Srinivas, Sneha and Ritwika. It was a great discussion. It was very enlightening. I think we managed to cover a lot of ground. And I think hopefully the takeaway that all of us will take here is that government is not just about what we read in the newspapers. It is something very real. And the realist part of government is what is closest to us, as Srinivas sort of mentioned. And we have to find ways in which to empower this government closest to us, and whether that's through the law, through the constitution, or through building awareness and information campaigns. This is a task that is going to be ongoing for many years to come. And hopefully we will have much more to talk about and report our successes on it in the coming years. Thank you all once again for joining this webinar. Do stay tuned for such webinars happening later in the course of the week. Please do check out the Vidhi Facebook and the Twitter page. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.